Our second speaker is Professor Mao Ping Tian Dan. That's the pronunciation by Taiwanese, very similar. Professor Dan, she got a medical degree from University of Nottingham, and then go on to get the doctorate of medicine from Newcastle University, also in the United Kingdom. And then he began to be appointed by University of Malaysia and has been promoted to professor since the 2017. And more importantly, during her professional career, he has been elected a member of Royal College of Physicians, and now is also a fellow of the Academy of Medicine of Malaysia. And today, she will share with us AGELESS longitudinal study of aging, biomarkers for cognitive frailty trajectory. Let's welcome Professor Tan.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah. I won't stand behind the podium because you can't see me, so I'll have to stand up here. Hopefully it works. Okay, right. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the work that we've done. And Malaysia, I've been looking at all the work that's been done, presented, and with great admiration, because Malaysia is actually a lower middle income country. So we don't necessarily have the similar magnitude of resources to try and do the same sort of things. But we still need to do research in Malaysia, so I'd share with you what we're doing to align ourselves with what other people are doing. But of course, we can't spend those sort of big monies to actually chase after biomarkers. So just to let you know a bit of background about the AGELESS study. So AGELESS stands for Transforming Cognitive Frailty into Later Life Self-Sufficiency. So, and this, when we first conceived the AGELESS study, it was actually to combine two longitudinal cohorts of aging that started in 2013. Now, if you've been following the political climate in Malaysia, you would have realized that everything went wrong in 2017 when the cohorts needed further input into actually maintaining the cohorts. So we ran out of money, basically, because somebody stole it all. And it's just one person. After that, we had a lot of political turmoil. And so we got together and we went, well, how do we keep this cohort going? And so the decision was to merge the cohorts to form the AGELESS study. So the concept of the AGELESS study is to actually look at a condition called cognitive frailty. So we do know this is just from the tour study, we still have problems harmonizing both studies. So sometimes we present this data and sometimes we present that data. So, so this is from the tour cohort, 9% of our population were frail and 61% pre-frail. This is from the 2013 data. And that's a frailty phenotype. And then this is mild cognitive impairment, 16 to 21% mild cognitive impairment. That's using MOCA. And so we decided to look at the gaps. So a lot of things we do in Malaysia, we don't do shotguns because we have no money. So we look at gaps and then we target specific gaps. So accurate diagnostic tools we don't have. And then we wanted to look more about psychosocial factors and societal burden to influence policy. And then we have a microbiologist in our group who wants to do some microbiome work. So we're looking at the gut-brain axis. And then we also have the National University of Malaysia who actually wants to look at the finger study. So this is actually the finger study, the Malaysian version of the finger study, which is called the AGELESS trials, personalized rehabilitative approaches. So our uniqueness about our finger study is that we're actually targeting cognitive frailty rather than a general population or MCI population. And then we also work with Monash University Malaysia to actually develop mobility solutions. So they don't have to be really fit to get around. If you create an environment where even frail people find it easy to get around, like in Taiwan, then it's actually still possible for them to function despite having cognitive frailty. So at the time that the study was conceived, this was what we thought about cognitive frailty. So hopefully at the end of the talk, you'll realize that this is not actually what cognitive frailty is. So this was this was what Panza et al. In 2018 actually postulated. So cognitive frailty is actually the coexistence of cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, and physical frailty. So and this Panza said that you start in this spectrum. You start with no cognitive frailty, and then you develop reversible cognitive frailty, and then it becomes irreversible cognitive frailty. So, so what we wanted to do was to actually be able to detect cognitive frailty before it becomes symptomatic, and so that we can actually potentially reverse all this and reduce the burden of cognitive frailty in our country, which, as you have seen, is actually extremely high among our older adults. So this is the AGELESS program. So what we wanted to do was, as I mentioned, was to actually look at how we detect it. So this is the biomarker arm, together with the microbiome arm, and then to look at socioeconomic stuff, mobility, as well as intervention. And so this is the cohort. When we collected data in 2013, we actually recruited them at 55 and over, so that we had a cohort that could actually last some time, because life expectancy in Malaysia is much lower than life expectancy in developed countries. So we were expected to lose this cohort quite fast if we started at 60 or 65. And then with the AGELESS study, we actually had 4 states and the Federal Territory, but we also recruited people fresh from Sarawak, Penang, and Negeri Sembilan, 3 more states. And then Sarawak was very important. Not just because Angelique comes from there, but also because Sarawak is East Malaysia, and we didn't have a state in East Malaysia. But it's very challenging. I wish I had time for the videos, but if you want, I can show you some nice videos of us going to the Sarawak longhouses. And then we also needed to top up our cohort because there's a high attrition rate, so we also went about doing that. And then there was a sub-study where we actually did MRI and neurological and EEG. We wanted to do FNAIRS, but ordering became very challenging over the pandemic, so near-infrared has now been cancelled. So these are the things that we did. We did socio-demographics, medical history, quality of life, anthropometrics, physical performance, cognitive testing, and then we took blood samples and stool samples, and these were the outcomes of interests. And then what we planned to do was to put it all together and use machine learning, AI, to actually help us come up with early detection. Okay, so and then the pandemic happened, and so we actually we found ourselves having to pivot to actually the virtual survey, and it was extremely challenging because people keep saying to us, "You are a lower middle income country, so how you expect to be able to actually interview older people using smartphones and computers and tablets?" Well, we don't like to take no for an answer. Well, at least I don't. So, so this is what we did. We did pivot, and we actually went on to use mainly telephone-based tools, but we tried as much as possible to actually interview them on their smartphones. So we did, and also a lot of them have access to computers, and smartphone penetration in Malaysia is 200%. So we're actually pretty good, even in very remote parts of Malaysia. We could actually get interview them, but of course with a lot of perseverance and with a lot of support. So instead of using Mocha, we moved to Mocha blind. Instead of using enterometry, to look at frailty, we actually did SAC-F and the frail scale, and then the rest was actually quite straightforward. It didn't really need that much. It wasn't really that much work. So these are the cohort characteristics. So remember, AGELESS was a follow-up study of Tour and Malor. So Tour, the mean age was around about 69. But so we're talking about 6 years later, so they're now 75. And then this is the ethnic composition. So the recruitment criteria for Malur and Tour were different. Malur actually stratified by ethnicity, so we had equal numbers of ethnic groups. And then Tour was supposed to be a nationally representative cohort, so we have overrepresentation by Malays. We don't have 62% Malays in Malaysia, 30% Chinese and 5% Indians, so underrepresentation of the Indians. So by putting them all together, we actually have a very representative cohort. Okay, so now we have a nationwide cohort, 300 in Sarawak. Kelantan, Penang, we didn't do so well, but this is another story. It should go up to about 300 at some point when I get around to get my negotiation skills out. 300 here, and then a large proportion, 1,500 in Selangor and Kuala Lumpur. Okay, so this is the MOCA test. So the mean MOCA test scores for our population was 25, and we fell out with MOCA because MOCA wanted us to pay for training, and it caused a lot of problems. So we did pay for training because we're honest people, and we did have to use MOCA because we use it in the initial wave, but we then decided to administer it together with a visual cognitive assessment tool, which was actually developed by Nagendran from Singapore. They don't use it in Singapore, but I tell Nagendran it's very useful in Malaysia because it is non-language bias and because it is entirely visual, and as long as the administrator and the respondent speak the same language, it's all pictures, you can still administer it. And we get pretty close scores with MOCA. So at some point, if MOCA decides to be really silly about training, then we will just phase out MOCA and just move towards VCAT. The frailty scores I'll show later. And we also asked them, because we did this intra-pandemic, whether they were less active or more active over the pandemic. 30% said they were less active, 15% said they were more active, and then whether they were anxious or more anxious or less anxious. And then 12% said they were more anxious, and 8% said they were less anxious, and around about the same number said they were less depressed and more depressed. So actually our older population are pretty resilient. They didn't do so badly over the pandemic. So okay, so now this actually looks at the frailty outcomes of our cohort. So after following them up for 7 years at that point, we were actually able to look at what frailty scale would we use for Malaysia, and to our pleasant surprise, the answer was any one of them. They're just as good. They correlated very well. They correlated decently, but the problem is that they can't be used in. We have got problems about using them interchangeably. So when we looked at 7-year mortality using the Rockwood, Freed, the SOF, as well as the Tilburg's, then we actually found that all of them actually significantly predicted mortality at 7 years, with the mortality for those who are frailer higher than the ones who are pre-frail compared to those who are robust. That's pretty good. But so this is actually looking at the correlation. So this is the correlation, and correlation is strong for some. So the CHS is actually the Freed study, and then CSHA is actually the Rockwood's. Freed's phenotype, and then this is Rockwood's. So the SOF and Freed correlated quite strongly, and the rest had moderate correlation. And also we looked at agreements, so frail, non-frail agreement, and there was all significant agreement, but not perfect agreement. So all of them were useful as tools for frailty, but they can't be used interchangeably. Okay, so this is the Kaplan-Meier plot because we've got them. As you can see, if you're frail, using Rockwood's, using A is Rockwood, Freed, B is Tilburg's for some strange reason, C is actually the SOF. Sorry, this is Rockwood, D, and then A is Freed, and you can see that there's clear separation. Those who are frail actually die faster, pre-frail a little bit less fast. And then these are people who are robust. Okay, so let's move on a bit. So what we wanted to know, how many of our cohort actually had cognitive decline. And MOCA became a problem because we found that there was actually a significant learning effect. So after 7 years, the whole cohort scored a lot better. So we did have issues with a follow-up, as you would imagine. We couldn't contact some of them. You know, we basically are doing data collection at a time where we couldn't go to people's houses, and then phones, we had changed from landlines to mobile phones, so we actually had difficulties contacting some of our cohorts. And some of them had passed on, but we do have actually mortality data for them, so that's not too bad. But overall, 13% of our cohort had a MOCA score drop of 2 or more. So I move on a bit. So biomarkers. So we basically looked at physiological biomarkers. This is a personal interest of mine, using beat-to-beat blood pressure. So we are always very fussy about blood pressure, but we all still do one snapshot blood pressure at the office. But we actually have technology now to measure blood pressure with every single heartbeat using non-invasive beat-to-beat blood pressure monitoring. So we have, this is the setup. This was actually in Newcastle where I trained. Then this is Leslie, one of our nurses. But I have this similar setup now in Kuala Lumpur. This is a task force monitor. And we measure beat-to-beat blood pressure using a finger cuff. And that's synchronized to beat-to-beat to ECG signals. And so this will give us continuous beat-to-beat blood pressure recordings will give us very short-term blood pressure variability. So you can do this in 10 minutes in your clinic. And the ones that we have been reading in the literature is long-term, so visit to visit, and also mid-term, which is day-to-day. So usually this is done with home blood pressure monitoring, and then the short-term ones, which is 24-hour blood pressure monitoring. But you can do this. You can do very short term in 10 minutes in your clinic. And so we looked cross-sectionally at MOCA scores versus blood pressure variability. I'm just showing the frequency domain one. I won't try and explain what it is. But so basically the higher the number, the higher variability from beat to beat. And we look at it as high frequency and low frequency variability. So low frequency variability, no association with MOCA scores. But when we look at high frequency variability, compared to the people with the lowest MOCA tertiles had significantly higher high frequency systolic blood pressure variability compared to those who had the highest MOCA tertile. And there was also a significant difference in people in the second tertile, but of course the difference was less. So potentially we could actually use very short-term blood pressure variability, high frequency, as potentially a biomarker for cognitive impairment. So we thought, okay, short-term, cross-sectionally, increased blood pressure variability is associated with reduced cognition. So let's look longitudinally now. We've got follow-up data. So to make this simple, we've actually we've just dichotomized this. So we've did both time domain and frequency domain blood pressure variability. So we couldn't find anything with the frequency domain, so I'll just contend with the time domain. So time domain, we use coefficient of variability and standard deviation. Okay, and then when we looked at those who had 2 or more points decline in MOCA versus those who had no decline, our jaw dropped. The relationship was the other way. So what we found was that individuals with higher blood pressure variability at baseline actually had a significantly lower risk of cognitive decline at 7-year follow-up. We went, oh, that's interesting. So it was totally unexpected. And in fact, the student kind of went into hiding for 3 months thinking that she's not going to pass her PhD, so I had to go and find her. And then we sat down and we talked about it and we read about it, and then we decided that this actually potentially can be explained by a phenomenon called hormesis, which means that in order for us to age healthily, we actually need an element of mild stress. So we're looking at a normal population. This is not a sick population. And so having increased blood pressure variability could potentially expose them to mild stress, and therefore that actually reduce the risk of cognitive decline. So there's a lot more we can do about this, but this is the current hypothesis. So moving on to cognitive frailty, when we look at 5-year adverse health outcomes. So when we looked at cognitive frailty at baseline, we also wanted to know whether it was associated with adverse outcome, whether it's a useful thing to look at. So cognitive frailty was actually quite complex, as you can see, because it's a combination of cognitive impairment and physical frailty. So then we divided it into 5 groups. So we have those who were robust, and those who were pre-frail only, frail, MCI and pre-frail, and MCI and frail. We didn't have people who had MCI only, so there was none on that group. And basically what we found was people with cognitive frailty, so this is a CF group, had significantly increased risk of falls, hospitalization, and also sarcopenia at long-term follow-up, but no increase in cognitive memory worsening. But we could actually account for falls by adjusting for ethnicity. So ethnic differences accounted for this, and then hospitalization also for ethnic differences. So ultimately, it was the sarcopenia that was actually statistically significant after all adjustments. So transitions. So this is exciting. When we came up with this curve, everyone wanted to draw it. This is called an alluvial curve. And what we have is, this is baseline, and this is follow-up. So the placing of this makes sense. I was talking to Belinda about this, and she told me I was actually extremely OCD. But so this is a cognitive frailty group, the red one at the top, and then you have frail, MCI only, pre-frail and MCI, I think. Can't see. Pre-frail and MCI, and then pre-frail only, and then the robust group. So we lost quite a few to follow up. That's a loss to follow-up chunk. So let's not look at those. And then quite a few also passed on. The mortality rate was around about 10% at that time. But when you look at cognitive frailty, a tiny number of cognitive frailty people came back, because of course follow-up, they needed to come. And if they were cognitively frail, they would have deteriorated and we would have lost them. So the ones who came back, not all, remain cognitively frail. Some had died. They were at higher risk of death, remember, and some had reverted to only MCI, and a small number had reverted to pre-frail and cognitive frailty, but none of them reverted to robust. So if you have cognitive frailty, then you can't actually fully become robust, and so this is a transition. Okay, so. But then we said, okay, what's a low-lying fruit? What can we look at as a predictor of cognitive frailty longitudinally? So what we looked at was what predicted the transition states, and so we decided to look at psychological status. So these are psychological status at baseline. So depression, anxiety, and stress were determined using the DAS-21 because that was validated in Malaysia in the relevant languages. I forgot to say that in Malaysia you have to do everything in Malay, Chinese, Tamil, and English. So we had to find tools that were available for all those 4 languages because we have pretty high, a lot of ethnicities, and they don't all speak English or Bahasa Malaysia. So anyway, so depression. So when we just dichotomized them into normal to mild depression versus those with moderate, severe, extremely severe depression, what we found was that, for those who actually reverted back into a lower state, we called them the improved group. For those who stayed the same or got worse, we called them the worsened group. That's just makes sense. So when we looked at those who are depressed, they were significantly more likely to have worsened. But when we actually looked at whether they could actually improve, they were depressed, then basically if you had depression, your CF status was very unlikely to revert, back to normal. Nobody actually reverted to normal. And that was the same with stress. But anxiety, yes, if you had moderate to severe anxiety, you were more likely to have a worsening in your CF status, but you were less likely to have improvement. So psychological factors actually predicted the transition of cognitive frailty. I will look at circulating biomarkers. So we thought everybody does circulating biomarkers, so we want to do some too. But we do it in our way, because we have no money for metabolomics, so we actually chose a few. So we had so we sat down and we said, which ones can we choose? And so we decided to go for IL-6. And thank you for Prof. Chang Won for actually going through what these biomarkers did so that I don't have to waste time explaining it. So we went for IL-6, myostatin, follistatin, TNF-alpha, and high-sensitivity CRP. So we could, high-sensitivity CRP is very cheap. We just send it to the lab. So we sent all our samples to the lab and got all of them back. And they were significant for increased BMI, sarcopenia, and falls, not significant. But we actually found that follistatin was significantly associated with falls. So we actually can have follistatin as a biomarker, potentially as a biomarker for falls, as well as increased BMI. Okay, so in this study, we actually wanted to look at sarcopenic obesity, because that's a really big problem in our country, and falls. So we also we also looked at MRI markers. So this is MRI segmentation. And what we found was that muscle bulk was actually significantly associated with falls in people who actually had an increased BMI, but not in those with a normal BMI. Okay, so finally, last slide. This is actually what we've lined up all our circulating biomarkers, physical biomarkers, and anthropometric biomarkers. I think these ones are our MRI biomarkers to look at how they correlate. And basically, this is a heat map. So the darker you are, the stronger the correlation. And what we found was that the correlation varied a lot, and some of them were better than others. So from here, what we found was if you could actually potentially use this map to identify which biomarkers we could use to actually predict healthy aging. But I'm not going to go through it, it'll take too much time. Okay, so I'd like to acknowledge all our grant funders, as well as all our research team. And this is the picture of what we did. So this was data collection in Penang. This is in Johor. Afterwards, they went to the beach. It was really nice. And this is in Ipoh. They went for dim sum afterwards. And this was in Kelantan, in Pasir Mas. So this data collection effort has now involved thousands of medical students, research assistants, and also investigators. So I'd like to thank all of them that made all this possible. It is really a lot of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen, for your excellent talk, particularly your experience of conducting a virtual survey during the COVID-19. So it seemed to me you always remain very optimistic. That's very good for healthy aging. Okay, so now we pass to the third speaker.
Yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity to introduce our next speaker.